So we all have those moments, and Hannah and I used to work together at the Department of Ed, so that kind of made that even funnier. And Julie Young, who is here today, who will be on the panel, who's the CEO for Florida Virtual School, is actually one of the founding board members of the organization, the nonprofit that I now work for. This nonprofit was started in 2003 with grants from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Hewlett Foundation. And I was at the U.S. Department of Education and saw this, what was then a startup nonprofit. And now we have 4,000 members and in all 50 states and 52 ministries of education around the world. I currently serve on EU Advisory Board for Virtual Schools. Their European Commission is doing an inventory of virtual schools worldwide, and this is a really interesting group to be part of. Right now, they have cataloged 250 virtual schools across the United States, and the remaining, the rest of the world, they've calculated about the same, about 250 virtual schools worldwide in every continent, all being driven by different purposes and educational goals. So it's a really fascinating landscape, and I loved my job at the Department of Education. I was lucky. I was a direct report to the secretary and got to work across higher ed and K-12 and look at technology innovation across sectors, and was charged with writing the National Education Technology Plan back in 2004 for Congress. And in this process, it's really terrific because every state and every district opens their doors up and brings you in and lets you look at everything they're doing. And I was able to come to Massachusetts several times during those trips. And I've been to 48 of the 50 states and traveled to many countries internationally. The other thing that was interesting was when foreign ministries of education came in, they always wanted to talk to the technology person and share what they were doing. So I felt very, very lucky to have the opportunity to scan what was happening both internationally and nationally. And 6 years at this nonprofit, this field has grown tremendously, and it's being driven by the cause of equity, by the cause of, if you look in the U.S. and that we spend, like the latest U.S. Department of Ed number from 08 and 09, more than $12,000 per pupil in K-12 education annually. And yet we have some of the biggest disparities of any developed. We do have the biggest disparities in haves and have-nots in terms of educational attainment between groups of kids. It's pretty stark. No other country spends more money than us except for Switzerland, and we have among the lowest results. 40% of our high schools in the US offer no AP courses. 40%. I was just with one of my colleagues in California working for Riverside School District. The University of California system, so the state university system and CSU, California State Universities, require these college-ready courses. They call them A to G requirements. Even to apply, you won't even be considered. 40% of high schools in California don't offer the full complement of A to G requirements. These kinds of things are driving online learning. The number one reason that districts use online learning and students are interested is because the course is otherwise unavailable at their school. And you may think, and certainly across New England, you have lots of access to great education here. But even in your best schools, I will challenge, in your suburban schools, the great schools like I went to in Fairfax County, Virginia, there were a number of seats in those AP courses, and not every kid had access to those AP classes that could have been taking those AP classes in those schools. So the U.S. Department of Ed has done some studies, National Center for Educational Statistics, and cataloged this growth. And it's really interesting. Back in 2000, there were about 50,000 enrollments in online courses in K-12 education. Today, it's about 1.8 million. So the growth has been dramatic, and I would argue faster than any other innovation in education. And that growth, again, is being driven to level the playing field and provide equity for all of your students. The other thing that's happened, so if you go back to 2002, 2003, there were a handful of states that had state virtual schools. Julie Young, Florida Virtual School was the first state virtual school. They have done amazing work on policy with legislation over those years. And if you think back to '97, and Julie's here to tell her story, so I just want to put it in perspective. They have done so much work on policy that she's got some really great advice about what works and what doesn't in terms of this equity agenda. The other thing that's really interesting about virtual schools and online learning is that we know this. I used to work on technology policy in the state of Arizona. Every other industry has been transformed by technology, right? Well, I'm not going to sit here and make that argument. We know this. But it hasn't been from layering technology on top of old models of doing business or the way things work. You have to look and redesign the system and go through that process of redesign before bringing the technology in to do whatever those goals you're trying to reach. So we've spent $60 billion in the US over the last 15 years on education technology. That's federal, state, and local spending. And largely, we see a 4-to-1 student-to-computer ratio with 4 computers in the back of the classroom collecting dust, right? Kids, a big shift has happened, and we all know this. I mean, when kids are outside of school, they spend an average of 24 hours a week watching television, 27 hours a week on the internet. So this whole shift is happening. The average amount of time a kid is able to use a computer in school is about 15 minutes, and that's usually a kid that's accelerated, finish their work early, go in the back and do something on those computers. So let me try to put this all in perspective. So driver as an equity to level the playing field. But online learning is giving us a chance to say, if we were to create student-centered learning, what's the one thing we know about kids, right? Kids are all different. I'm not going to argue different learning styles and all that. We know that every kid learns at their own pace. So what is the one thing that we do in schools, right? One teacher, 20 kids, a single textbook, everybody's learning at their same pace. We are not giving the opportunity for our brightest students to move ahead and give them everything they can be. Stephen Heppel, who's in the UK, says there's no reason we shouldn't be able to design schools so that there is no limit to how fast and how far any student can go. He is part of this Not School movement. They do a lot with online learning. There should be no limit to how fast and how far kids can go. So when I was at the U.S. Department of Ed looking around, out of all the ways that technologies were used in education, the single biggest innovation and the single biggest promise of changing the future of education, and this is in the classroom walls and outside of the classroom walls, unleashing this formative versus formal learning versus informal learning, was that when students and when these virtual school programs were designing courses, they were totally rethinking. Take the Massachusetts standards in your academic content. How do we rethink every piece of content before we move it into an online course? How do we allow for students to go at their own pace? How do we rethink how a student demonstrates mastery in that course? How do we retrain teachers to be able to teach in new collaborative ways, using all the communications technologies that students are going to have to know how to use in college or in their careers? 1 in 3 college students today takes an online course, and often on campus for scheduling flexibilities. Well, this is pervasive throughout society. 50% of workforce training is done online. So there have been 4 states since 2006, Michigan was the first state, to require an online course for graduation. Why did Michigan do this? As a way, look at the economy in Michigan, right? They're in really tough shape. Well, they saw that all of this training was happening online. They looked at all of these displaced workers and they said, if they were going to go back to even community colleges or universities, most of these students would be accessing online learning. So they did it as a way for students in high school to start accessing and understanding the tools and the skills to use online learning at a younger age. And so when they went to colleges and universities for lifelong learning, they would have this access. I think it might be helpful to understand the framework. We're also in a big project right now with the Gates Foundation called Next Generation Learning Challenges. $12 million right now in what we call wave 3 of these grants. You know, they do these grand challenges for healthcare, for global health, like let's put out a $5 million challenge and say, try to pull up the innovators from the field. How do we eradicate malaria? And they get all these 5-page proposals and they go through and they find these brilliant scientists around the world in different places that they didn't know about. This is the idea, nobody's ever done this in education, so we're doing this next generation learning challenges. And components of this are around online learning. How can we use advanced technologies to dramatically change and improve student outcomes in ways that we couldn't conceive as possible in traditional environments? So the mission of our nonprofit, and we're still driven by philanthropic funding, although we do have 4,000 members, so we have our reach into what's happening in districts, in online schools around the country and around the world. Our mission is to say, does every student have access to a world-class education, regardless of their geography, social economic background, income level? Does every kid have access to a world-class education? I was on the phone, actually on Skype, about 4 years ago with folks from the International Baccalaureate Program in their offices in the UK. How many people are familiar with the IB program, right? IB is a really rigorous program, and they said, we have this idea. We came to your conference, and we saw that you have, today we have 32 states that have state virtual schools that are offering supplemental online courses to kids across the state. Well, we came to your conference and we saw that you have these states offering courses, and we think that we can raise enough philanthropic funding and create an IB diploma program online. So that's a really interesting idea. They were working with 26 countries. They were taking that IB content and creating what they called gold standard online courses. Really great curriculum, dynamic, much more engaging, and training their best teachers to teach online. As you know, in the IB program, there's a big focus on discourse and Socratic method, and how do you use discussion boards and having kids react to other kids' papers, talk, how do you use tools like Skype to have them communicate in discussion groups, so both asynchronous and synchronous technologies to carry on these discussions. Since then, they have launched the IB Diploma Program online, and they're across 125 different countries. And now they have students interacting with students globally on issues, ideas, discussions. So I ask when I go around the US, does every student in your district have access to IB? Because they could have access by flipping a switch through IB Online, right? And that's true with online learning and online courses, making them available as opportunities for students. I'm not going to say that every student has to take an online course necessarily, but if students need those courses and it's appropriate for them in their academic careers, we should make them available. We can. We could close that gap tomorrow on the 40% of high schools and those kids that don't have access to AP courses. But it's interesting to see, I'm just real quickly going to take a little trip around the world and do this global snapshot, because I know that even when I was working in state policy in Arizona and at the US Department of Ed, it was really interesting to see what was happening globally. Back in 2004, Mexico invested in digital content. They digitized their entire K-12 content curriculum. They provide a laptop to every new teacher. All of their university pre-service programs train those teachers how to use digital content. Turkey, back in 2007, they're one of our members, the government was looking at ways to increase STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math programming across K-12 and higher ed. They were looking at public-private partnerships to increase STEM and developing what they considered gold standard online courses in these STEM subjects. They had no students learning online at that time. In the first year, How many kids were taking these online classes in STEM? 5 million. Did you hear me just say that we've been doing this for 15 years in the US and 1.8 million students have access? 5 million in the first year. By the third year, 15 million of 16 million students accessing it. In India, it was right when I started this job, back in 2005, I was in Beverly Hills at an international education conference. It was huge, and I was on a panel on innovative technologies with someone from India, Shantanu Prakash. He was working on a program called EduComp with the Indian Ministry of Education. They have a new goal to provide universal access to K-12 education to every student in India. This is a huge undertaking for that country. In order to do it, they would have to build 200,000 new school buildings, which they can't afford to do, and they're not going to. So what did they charge EduComp with doing? They charged them with internationally benchmarking world standards academic curriculum, digitizing that curriculum and bringing it in, and they have shortages of high quality teachers and great teaching. So they want to train their best teachers to teach online because they see a new distribution model and a new way to reach students. So Julie and I were actually here in Boston at one of Paul Peterson's conferences at Harvard on international education last fall. And he had invited Shantanu Prakash to come back. And I said, I haven't seen you, in years. What's happening with EduComp? And he said, oh, well, after 6 years, we have 12 million students accessing our online curriculum. And they're setting up new models where they're opening flexible community technology centers and bringing in tutors, teachers, experts to work with kids. And the kids are hungry. They know that education is the source of future success. So in this globally competitive workforce, there are major changes happening both in developed countries and underdeveloped countries. In China, we did an international survey. They have a goal to reach how many more kids in the next 10 years with education? They have a goal to reach 100 million more students. And how are they going to do this? It's not the old-fashioned way. They are going to digitize. They have worked on digitizing their content, delivering high-quality online courses, and training their best teachers in their urban areas to reach across into their rural countryside. The World Bank estimates that China may be the first country to succeed in educating most of its population through the internet. From 2003 to 2007, they spent about $1 billion to implement online learning projects in the rural countryside. This is a scalable solution that can customize and personalize instruction for every student. You've noticed that I have mentioned a teacher in every single case. This is not about teacherless. This is about teacher-led and new distribution models taking advantage of our best teachers and thinking differently. Let me give you another example from the US. In the state of Georgia, there are 440 high schools, and how many licensed physics teachers teaching? 88. They only have 88 licensed physics teachers in all of their schools. They have huge shortages of teachers. How many new physics teachers did their colleges of ed turn out in the last 2 years? Uno. One. So all of these initiatives around STEM education are great, but until we start rethinking the distribution model or taking advantage of how we can bring people that understand the subject matter through competency-based education, we have got to rethink what the future of education looks like. And other countries are doing it, and they're doing it for global competitiveness. So when we ask ourselves, does every student have access to a world-class education? So I'll turn back to the United States. So in the US, again, some of the most exciting things I saw when I was at the US Department of Ed were in how online learning was leveling the playing field. But even when I took this job, there were only 8 states that had state virtual schools. So if you lived in one of those states, like Florida or Michigan or Illinois or Kentucky, you had access to these courses. And if you didn't as a student unless your district happened to have enough resources, enough expertise. It takes a lot of expertise to develop high quality online courses. It's not hard to throw a PowerPoint together, but it is hard to design high quality online curriculum, and it takes a lot of skill and effort in the professional development and the capacity building for teaching teachers to teach online. To me, it is absolutely amazing that our colleges of education are not training our teachers to use digital content, teach online, teach in blended models in the classroom. In Singapore, they train every single one of their teachers to teach online in their colleges of education, and they have blended learning in 100% of their secondary schools. Why do they do this? It started with SARS in 2003, when they started having to shut schools down and never knowing when the schools were going to open or not because people were getting sick. So they started an initiative. Every school is a learning management system. Every school uses digital content, and every teacher is trained to teach online. They hold e-learning week 1 week a year, where they physically shut schools down and ensure that the teaching and learning can happen anytime, any place from home. So what happened recently with H1N1, right? What did we do in the US? What did you do in Massachusetts when a kid or a teacher got sick? We physically shut schools down for 5 days, right? Totally stopped the learning productivity, right? In Singapore, they have a whole scale for learning continuity. So if somebody gets sick, they can stay home. If they can learn, they can still access the courses. But they can keep school going. If the school has to shut down, they can still access those learning resources. But you don't have this total productivity shift. In Hong Kong, the same thing. In Hong Kong, in South Korea, they are making a digital transition. They are moving away from paper textbooks to high-quality digital resources. So this is really interesting. In the US, so back when I started, 8 states have state virtual schools, and about 8 states had full-time online learning schools, online learning opportunities, virtual charter schools. Today, there are 30 states plus the District of Columbia that have full-time online schools, virtual charter schools, and there are 32 states that have state virtual schools, which is pretty amazing. That is rapid growth for any innovation. And yet, not every student in those states has access. Some states have put geographic restrictions on those schools. Some states have put enrollment caps on those schools. So depending on where you live will still depend on what kind of education you can access. In some states, the state virtual schools are funded by appropriation. In fact, in most states. Julie has done an amazing job in Florida because they have funding that follows the student down to the course enrollment. And that is a really important piece of policy around the funding. In Massachusetts, I was really excited when you passed the legislation to allow those innovative schools. I spent some time talking to the folks in the State Department of Ed about what to do and what not to do. And I said, if you do anything, do not put geographic restrictions on your online schools. It is a scalable solution. It is a choice for students. They don't have to enroll if they don't want to learn in a fully online environment. And don't put geographic restrictions on them. Don't put enrollment caps on them. And have the funding follow the student. So what did they do? They put geographic restrictions on it, they put enrollment caps on it, and they have the funding so that when the student goes there, the district that they live in has to physically write a check after the fact to the school where they're going. That works really well, right? The other thing about Massachusetts is you're home to one of the original virtual high school, Global Consortium, right? When I was at the Department of Ed in 2000, they got one of the first Technology Innovation Challenge grants in '97. They were one of 2 of hundreds of those grants to be sustainable after the fact. It was that and Generation Yes. But depending on whether a district partners with them or not depends on whether a student has access and only for the number of seats in that program. In Florida, there are over 200,000 enrollments in supplemental online classes from across the state. And here that number is about 6,000, and it's really dependent on the district. We put out an annual report called Keeping Pace with K-12 Online Learning. There are lots of cool maps in here. This is free for download, or I'd be happy to send anybody a copy. Massachusetts has no policy related to supplemental online courses for any of their kids. So literally, depending on where your kids live and the zip code will depend on what access they have, and it's extremely limited here. So while 55% of all school districts across the US have some access to online courses, we don't have equal access. And one of the issues is these other countries, they can scale because they have national systems. I'm not advocating for a national system. We have local control here, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But when we look at whether our kids are going to be globally competitive, we do have to face the reality that other countries are innovating and they are scaling internationally benchmarked world-class education. And every time we see the PISA test, we've been flatlining for a long time. In Massachusetts, compared to the other top countries, if you took out, and you've seen Paul Peterson's work on this, right? If you took out Massachusetts 15 years ago or 20 years ago, they would have been leading the world. Now, even the kids in Massachusetts, which are certainly leading the United States, are falling way down in the scale of being globally competitive with other countries, and students across the world are outperforming them. So this isn't a message, it's just a reality check from when I'm traveling around other countries and around the world, and I get on an airplane and come home, and I'm traveling across, and I come into some of the education conferences that are national here, I feel like we're in a time warp. I feel like we're having the wrong conversations. We need to be asking, what does it mean to be globally competitive? And what is it about our system that we can do to make sure that every kid has these opportunities? I will tell you, the number one policy issue that we face in most states when I'm in most state capitals is seat time. And that is, we talk a lot about education funding levels, but nobody asks the formula of which schools get funded. I know this sounds kind of not straightforward, but when I was over in the EU and they asked what's your biggest policy issue, and I said, well, it's seat time funding, they're like, what are you talking about? They fund per pupil, but they have competency-based systems where kids can only advance once they've demonstrated the knowledge and skills through a performance, whether it's an essay or a project or writing. They have to demonstrate that they know that to advance further. What seat time does is we will only pay you as a school for 200 minutes or whatever it is of instruction, regardless of whether you get an A, B, C, D, or F. That means that kids, when they get to the 9th grade, can have huge gaps in their education, and then we end up having all of these dropouts. So we're doing a lot of work on competency-based education, and I'm pleased to tell you that your neighbors in New Hampshire actually got rid of seat time in 2009, redefining all Carnegie units in terms of competencies. And there is a movement that's funded by the Nellie Mae Education Foundation on proficiency-based pathways with a number of other states in New England, so I think we're going to see a lot more. I expect in the next 5 years for 10 states across the US to move from seat time to competency-based learning, and that is going to start to change everything. Because once you set up and start measuring around learning, then that system change that has to happen, we'll be able to better think it. And that's going to be exciting because that's where the new learning models through online and blended learning are really going to take off. But right now we're implementing a lot of these online courses still in the basis of seat time, which is a big challenge. So big policy issues that need to be addressed: seat time, geographic restrictions, enrollment caps. Teacher training and preparation is a big one. And because our system is so decentralized, there are only about 5 universities across the country that are providing teacher training and online learning. And that is something that has to change. I know I was just with some folks from the University of Pennsylvania, and they are going to start doing coursework in online training in their College of Ed and doing internships in online schools for their teachers that are training, which is great. Programs like virtual schools and supplemental programs. Funding following students down to the course level is another big breakthrough in policy that we're seeing around the country. So they have it in Florida for Florida Virtual School. They also have that in Minnesota, and they've always had that in Minnesota since 1980. If a student is enrolled in their local high school and they take 3 courses, they can take 1 class from the local STEM magnet and 2 classes online, and the funding follows the student down to the course level. Utah, Senate Bill 65 last year just passed a law where funding follows a student down to the course level for online courses, and there's a performance-based funding component of that. They get 50% of the funding up front at the beginning of the course, 25% when the student finishes the course, and the other 25% based on a mastery level. So if it's an AP course and they score 3 or higher, they get an extra piece of it. So there's some interesting trends happening around the US, but it just takes us back to that quote that Stephen Heppel said. It just resonates with me. There should be no limit to how fast or how far students can go. And so rethinking the pace, the place, and the pathway that students can take, we should give them a whole range. And next generation learning, or these new models that are empowered by online learning, to me, give us hope and optimism. We spend so much time in K-12 education looking at all of the numbers across the country, state by state, and getting really frustrated. But we have reason to be cautiously optimistic. Cautiously optimistic. We have to focus on quality. This gets back to the seat time issue too. Right now, our quality measures across K-12 are really weak. I'll just end on a last note that I really appreciate being able to come up here and take the time, and if there's anything we can do to answer questions, we're happy to do it. But we're starting to see at the district level huge interest in this too. At our conference, which is about 2,000 people, 47% of the attendees were from districts wanting to start online programs. So there's a lot of innovation and a lot of interest. If we can take the best people that we have in education today and help innovate our own system and help our kids get that creativity and get those opportunities for them, I believe we can do what we need to do to turn the tide here in the US, but it will require action. And it all comes down, a lot of it comes down to the policy barriers that are out there. So, thank you.